Throughout World War II, there were many men and women who betrayed their nations and countries, and they sided with the German enemy. They turned their backs on their neighbours to collaborate with authorities such as the SS and Gestapo, which led to a huge amount of suffering and also death. But there were some high-ranking members of government who sold out their nations to the Germans, and with this, large swathes of the population were then deported to concentration camps. There were a number of public executions carried out in the aftermath of the war to deal with those traitors, and crowds of thousands of people saw vengeance being enacted upon former politicians, police chiefs, and many others. In this documentary, we look at 5 public executions of World War II traitors. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Born in December 1890, Laszlo Bardossi completed his schooling in Slovakia and also in Budapest. Whilst in the city, he trained as a lawyer and travelled to other European cities such as Paris and Berlin, and he learned German, English and French. He began a career in government in 1913, serving as an assistant clerk in the Hungarian government's Ministry of Culture and Education, and he continued to rise throughout the ranks. He was then made a ministerial secretary, and in February 1922, transferred to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was seen as an important Hungarian envoy and also a diplomat, and he went to different lands on government business. But following the First World War, Hungary had lost significant territory, and Hungary wanted to regain much of its land under the lands of the Crown of St. Stephen. With this, Hungary wished to claim lands from Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and Romania. But there were discussions to enlarge Hungary's territory and lands, and with this it absorbed certain areas, and they received support from Nazi Germany to revise their borders, and this brought Hungary and Germany closer, and on the 20th of November 1940, Hungary formally joined the Axis alliance. The Germans and Italians wanted to neutralise Yugoslavia to make an invasion of Greece much more straightforward. Hungary and Yugoslavia did sign a non-aggression pact on the 12th of December 1940, and Hungary at this time also wanted to limit any pressure from the Germans and also improve relations with the UK, who were possibly going to go to war with them. But in January 1941, the Minister of Foreign Affairs died and Laszlo Bardossi was appointed to the position. He believed that the Second World War would result in a German victory, and he quickly was thrust into the actions of politics during the world's deadliest conflict. He was told by the British that they weren't happy as they had allowed Germans to walk into Romania. Bardossi and the Prime Minister Paul Teleki met with the Yugoslav Foreign Minister to exchange documents relating to the Treaty of Friendship, but it was clear that Hungary was being manipulated by the Germans. They were making excuses to the Allies, and they were actively letting German troops pass through their lands to attack countries allied with Britain. Threats were made against Hungary if they joined in any attacks. Following the overthrow of the Yugoslav government, Hitler ordered his generals to attack, and he summoned the Hungary ambassador to Berlin. He offered Croatia to Hungary in a message to the regent of Hungary, and Bardossi tried to get him not to join in with the invasion. However, it was believed by Hitler that Hungary would join the invasion, and Hitler regarded Hungary as a friend of his. Bardossi wrote to the American and British ambassadors, communicating the likely collapse of Yugoslavia, and many warned in Hungary about the threat and resources that Britain and America had. Bardossi said it would be acceptable to enter former Hungarian lands in Yugoslavia after the country had collapsed. The British warned the Hungarian ambassador that if Hungary allowed German troops through the country to attack Yugoslavia, Britain would break off diplomatic relations. Hungary knew that any attack on Yugoslavia would breach the treaty that they had, and the Prime Minister Teleki even shot himself, as he believed Hungary had disgraced itself by siding with the Germans against Yugoslavia. In his note to the regent he wrote, "We have become breakers of our word, out of cowardice, in defiance of the Treaty of Eternal Friendship. We have placed ourselves at the side of scoundrels. We shall be robbers of corpses, the most abominable nation." But after Teleki took his own life, Bardossi was appointed Prime Minister. He remained interested in foreign affairs, and in control he pursued a strong pro-German foreign policy, and said an alliance with the Nazis would let Hungary retrieve its former lands. With this, the Germans invaded Yugoslavia, and part of the German invasion was launched from Hungarian territory. Attacks then occurred on Hungary from the Yugoslavs, and quickly after the land fell, the Axis puppet independent state of Croatia was proclaimed. Bardossi claimed to justify the invasion of Yugoslavia, but Winston Churchill held fire on declaring war on Hungary for a few months, until he was urged to do so by Joseph Stalin. The Hungarian attack, ultimately overseen by Bardossi, was described as the most shameful act of wartime Hungarian policy. Following this, they occupied lands and territory that formerly belonged to them, and these lands were then annexed. Bardossi also declared war on the Soviet Union, following an attack on the city of Kassa by 3 unidentified aircraft. He stood up in Parliament and with this violated the Hungarian constitution, declaring war without getting Parliament's consent. Britain then declared war on Hungary months later, and Bardossi also announced a state of war with America on the 15th of December 1941. But in Hungary, Bardossi's policies were rather similar to the Nazis, and he was a virulent anti-Semite. He limited Jewish employment opportunities and banned them from having relationships with non-Jews, and he also approved the policy of deporting Jews from territories seized from Yugoslavia. With this, he sanctioned the executions and killings of thousands of Jews. But on the 7th of March 1942, despite being only in the job of Prime Minister a matter of months, Laszlo Bardossi was forced out. Regent Horthy forced his resignation and decided to settle on a more moderate Prime Minister. It's believed that Horthy removed Bardossi for a number of reasons, possibly as he refused to stand up to the Germans more, or the fact he was compliant in the growth of the far right in his land. Also, he could have seen Bardossi as a reason why the Hungarian forces suffered heavily fighting the Soviet Union. But also Bardossi opposed a plan that would have elevated Horthy's son to the regency after his death. But after resigning as the Prime Minister, he then became the chairman of the fascist United Christian National League, and as the Germans occupied Hungary in 1944, he and his new followers collaborated with Prime Minister Dom Szocay and later Prime Minister Ferenc Szalai and his Arrow Cross Party. In this, Bardossi was working alongside a man who actively went after Jews and executed them, and also his men were involved in deporting dozens of thousands of people to the concentration camps, where they were killed as soon as they arrived. But as the Soviets advanced towards Hungary, he fled to Germany heading towards Bavaria. He obtained a visa to travel to Switzerland and then lived in a refugee camp, but was then deported back to Germany and was then arrested by the Americans as soon as he arrived. He was a man who, as the Prime Minister of Hungary, was responsible for the deportations of thousands of Jews, and also he had overseen his country as they were declared war on by Britain and also America. But after the end of the Second World War, he was sent back to his homeland, and on the 3rd of October 1945 was placed on trial for being a war criminal. He was accused of being complicit in mass murder, and also was charged with sending more than 60,000 Jews to Nazi death camps. He was ultimately found guilty of war crimes and of being a collaborator with the Nazis, and at his trial he was sentenced to death by a firing squad in Budapest. He was imprisoned inside one of the city's prisons for a few months, before on the 10th of January 1946 he was taken to the courtyard of the Academy of Music in Budapest. A Hungarian official read the death sentence of the former Prime Minister out aloud, and watching the execution were thousands of Hungarian civilians. Against the side of the building, a large number of sandbags had been set up to protect the crowd and the soldiers from ricocheting bullets. Accompanying Bardossi was a priest, who remained with him until the very end, and Laszlo Bardossi was then placed in front of the sandbags. He had his legs tied to prevent him from running or escaping, and the crowd surrounded him in a semicircle. There were thousands there, and he was dressed in a suit. Opposite him were 4 executioners, the firing squad armed with their rifles, who would take his life. The priest stepped to the side to allow the shooters to do their job and to take Bardossi's life. They were told to take aim, and the 4 soldiers did so before they fired straight into the former Prime Minister at very close range. Instantly he was killed. Shortly after this, a doctor went over to him, and his death was confirmed. Despite only being Prime Minister of Hungary for a short while, Laszlo Bardossi oversaw his country's involvement in the war. In his time in office, Britain and the US declared war on his nation, and also he allowed German soldiers to invade one of his former allies, and also moved his soldiers into these lands. He was hated by many inside of his country, and at the barrel of 4 rifles, he was executed inside of Budapest. Ferenc Szalai was born in January 1897, and he believed that he was given power to rule from God through his mother's milk. He lived with his mother right until 1944, and he followed his father's footsteps and joined the army as a young man. He finished his studies and then went to a military academy. He finished this and then was promoted to the rank of lieutenant in 1915, and he became an officer serving in the Austro-Hungarian army during the First World War. He was on the front lines for 3 years and was based on the Italian front before he was sent to Verdun in the final days of the conflict. Following the political struggles in Hungary after the war, Szálasi was apolitical, and he was not involved in political events post-war in Hungary. He continued to train inside of the military, and he enrolled in the General Staff Officers Training at other military academies. He was seen as an outstanding officer, and it's considered that he was popular and a beloved member of the military. His fellow officers saw him as very intelligent and a very skilled commander, but others believed he was too powerful. He continued to succeed in the military and achieved the rank of a major. When Gyula Gombos became the Prime Minister of Hungary around 1932, Szálasi became more involved in politics, and he then became obsessed with it. He was considered a fanatical right-wing nationalist who believed that Hungary should expand its borders back to former levels. It had previously had its lands reduced by around 72%, and he then wrote a pamphlet and sent it to other politicians, but because he was a soldier, he was banned from being involved in politics, and was sentenced to 20 days imprisonment, and was then expelled from the General Staff. Following his release, he then served as a staff officer, but then was disillusioned with the army, and he decided to give his time to politics. He first made the Party of National Will a nationalistic party, and this was later banned for being too radical. But then Szálasi set up the Hungarian National Socialist Party in 1937, but this was also banned, but he did gather support from lower classes and workers. This party was anti-Semitic, but following the German Anschluss of Austria, Szálasi's followers became more radical, and he himself was arrested and imprisoned. But he was then proclaimed the National Socialist Arrow Party leader, which was a coalition of several right-wing groups, and this attracted a large number of people to it. It gained 30 seats in power, and then became eventually one of the biggest parties in Hungary. But when the Second World War broke out, the Arrow Cross Party was banned, and Szálasi was forced to work underground, and he did gain the backing of the Germans. But in March 1944, the Nazis occupied Hungary. Hitler launched Operation Marguerite, and in this, his soldiers were told to occupy the country, and with this he instilled the pro-German Derm Szöcsé as the Prime Minister of Hungary. But the key thing for Szálasi was that the Arrow Cross Party was then legalised, and he was then able to attract more members to the party. But when the Prime Minister was quickly deposed, Szálasi then became an enemy of the Hungarian government, and the regent ordered his arrest. But the Germans in Szálasi had a perfect ally, and the Hungarian regent began to plan to come to peace with the Soviets and end Hungary's involvement in the Axis alliance. But the Germans then kidnapped his son and threatened to kill him unless the regent abdicated and put Ferenc Szálasi in power. A document was signed naming Szálasi as the Prime Minister, and this made the Arrow Cross Party partially in power. He was then placed as the head of the state, and then his government changed the Kingdom of Hungary into a puppet state of Nazi Germany. The Council of Regency was established and approved, and on the 4th of November 1944, Szálasi was made the leader of the nation, and he was joined in power by 16 ministers, half who belonged to his Arrow Cross Party. But whilst in power, he had very few other plans but to carry out the policies which pleased the Nazis. He executed the Nazi Party's beliefs and ideology, and he did this to please Hitler and to stop the Germans being a threat. Along with the Nazis, Szálasi's government recommended the deportation of the Jews which had been paused. His government promoted martial law, and they carried out large-scale executions of those who were considered possible enemies of Szálasi and his party. He also deported thousands of Jews, and many were executed and killed inside of the gas chambers, and despite not being in power for long, in particular 163 days, he had a devastating and deadly effect. He also sent large amounts of Hungarian produce and resources to Germany to help with their war effort, and he forced young and old men into the last remnants of the Hungarian army, being forced to fight the Soviet war machine of the Red Army. When he took control of the country, the Red Army were inside of Hungary, and his authority was rather limited, but his party did deport 80,000 people to the concentration camps. But on the 19th of November 1944, he had nowhere to go, as he was inside Budapest as it was encircled by the Soviet Red Army, and also the Romanian army, as they surrounded the city. This resulted in the 102-day siege of Budapest, but as it took hold, he managed to escape and flee. He fled to a city in the west of Hungary, then carried on to Vienna in March 1945, and then he went to Munich. But as Hungary capitulated and fell to the Soviets, the cabinet of the Arrow Cross Party had fled the lands, and it was dissolved on the 7th of May 1945, a day before Germany surrendered. But on the 6th of May, the day before, Ferenc Selassie was captured by the Americans, and months later was repatriated back to Hungary. The Hungarians then tried him by the People's Tribunal in Budapest, and many open sessions took place where war criminals were sentenced to death and were executed for high treason. Ferenc Selassie was placed on trial for high treason, but also war crimes, and he was deemed guilty of deporting thousands of his own people to their deaths in concentration camps. He was virtually hated by the Hungarian people, and on the 12th of March 1946, he was brought to Budapest in a town square, where he was to be executed. Along with two of his former ministers and a party theologist, the group of the Arrow Cross members were then led to where a number of large posts had been placed. The method of execution for Ferenc Selassie was hanging using the Austrian pole method, and a few large posts had been set up with a rope attached to a hook at the top. Selassie was taken up to the scaffold, and he was then flanked by guards, and members of the public watched on. He was placed with his back to the post, and his arms and legs were tied up, so he could not move. Then the noose was placed around his neck, and the rope was then tightened, before the executioner took the steps from underneath him. He had been given the last rites before, but the post only left a couple of feet between the hanging man and the ground, and this method of execution in particular led to him slowly strangling to death, rather than having his neck snapped. He struggled and strangled, but then he succumbed to his death shortly after, whilst the public looked on. He was then buried in a new public cemetery in Budapest, but Ferenc Selassie was considered a serious war criminal inside of Hungary, despite only being in office and power from the 16th of October 1944 to the 28th of March 1945. Despite initially being a military officer, he entered politics and crafted his right-wing ideas. But Selassie became a man whose party were involved in collaborating with the Nazis in their politics and beliefs, which resulted in the mass murder and brutality of people and their deaths inside of the concentration camps. But he was executed in front of a huge crowd in Budapest. Ion Antonescu was born into a bourgeois family which had some military background. He was born in 1882 and was a student at a number of military schools within Romania. He was a keen student and graduated in cavalry school as top of his class, and he did not shy away from conflict, as he made a name for himself during the 1907 Peasants' Revolt, in which he was in charge of a cavalry unit, and it was said that he was very violent in quashing the revolt with his unit. He managed to subdue the revolt in one city, and was praised by the king and prince for his effort. Antonescu was promoted a number of times, but when Romania entered the First World War in 1916, he was a chief of staff for General Constantin Prețan. In this, he played a key role in Romania's successful defence against German soldiers, but after the war he was also part of a military attaché in Paris and London. He continued to rise throughout different positions and gained more authority upon his return to Romania, before becoming the defence minister in 1937. He then in September 1940 rose to the position of Prime Minister. The king's popularity at the time was a record low, and Antonescu was appointed to help sort out the crisis. But within 2 days of being in the position of Prime Minister, the king transferred most of his dictatorial powers to Antonescu, and with this he became the dictator of Romania. He had forced the king off his throne, but his son did succeed him, but Michael was a puppet for Antonescu's regime. At the time in Europe, war was very much underway, but Romania found themselves surrounded by two huge foreign powers, and Antonescu then had to make the decision as to form an alliance with one of them to protect Romania and the interests of his country. He chose to side with Nazi Germany, and he hoped that by joining an alliance with them, that Romania would be protected. At the time, the Germans were aggressively expanding into new lands and were occupying large swathes of Europe. He hoped that Romania could be of use for Hitler in Nazi Germany, and Hitler saw the country as a valuable resource due to the oil inside of the nation, and he thought this would be useful for the German war effort. He built an alliance with the Revolutionary Fascist Party of the Iron Guard, and these were strongly anti-communist and anti-Semitic groups within Romania. Antonescu, when he came into power, brought the Iron Guard with him, but he later was forced to destroy the movement after the Legionnaires' rebellion. Their leader argued constantly with Antonescu, and Sima thought that the economic policy of Romania should be worked out with Germany, but Antonescu saw him as a threat. He gained Hitler's support and the support of the army to launch a 3-day civil war against the Iron Guard, and he won decisively, with the Romanian and German army backing him. At one point during the crisis, the Iron Guard were heavily involved in instigating deadly and savage attacks on the Jews, with many being executed publicly and mutilated. The Iron Guard party was smashed, but more bloodshed came. In June 1940, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, and Antonescu sent his troops with them as well. Romanian units served with German units, and initially it was thought by the Germans that the Roman army was poorly equipped and had insufficient armour and training. Antonescu ordered, without the Germans, for the Romanian army to maintain a 2-month siege of Edessa, and the Fourth Army suffered heavy losses of around 100,000 men. In Odessa there were large-scale massacres of the Jewish population, and this was allegedly ordered by Antonescu in reprisal. He was in regular meetings with Hitler and his German military commanders, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel described him as a capable soldier dedicated to his mission in life, open-hearted and forthright, but uncommunicative and often blunt. With the Germans, the Romanians fought deep into the Soviet Union, and following the Battle of Moscow, they were asked to provide more soldiers for the German war effort. Antonescu was briefed on the planned Battle of the Caucasus, and for committing his soldiers, Antonescu was given a car from Hitler. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Romania also declared war on America, but everything changed following the Battle of Stalingrad. During the horrific fighting around the city, Romania lost around 150,000 men, and more than half of their divisions were wiped out. They continued to lose many soldiers throughout the following months as the Soviets advanced, retaking their lands from the German and Axis invaders. His time as dictator of Romania saw him oversee a number of massacres of Jews, in which his soldiers slaughtered thousands. In the final weeks of December 1941, for example, his soldiers killed around 70,000 Jews at the Bogdanovka camp, and Antonescu justified it as a necessary evil to stop typhus spreading because of the poor conditions. As mentioned, the Odessa massacre was an act of punishment carried out by the Romanian army, and it's estimated that over 50,000 Jews were killed there. It's been claimed to have been the largest single massacre of Jews in the Second World War, and they were shot, hanged, and some were even burned alive. Antonescu claimed the events were merely reprisals and not war crimes, and dozens of thousands more people were forced out of the Odessa area. Antonescu stated, "Pack them in the catacombs, throw them in the Black Sea, but get them out of Odessa. I don't want to know, 100 can die, 1,000 can die, all of them can die, but I don't want a single Romanian officer to die." Following the loss of Stalingrad, Antonescu's popularity dwindled, and in April 1944, the Russian soldiers ordered the Romanians to surrender. He refused to do so, remaining stern in his support for Hitler, and in spring 1944, large-scale Allied bombing raids took place in Bucharest. The battle for Romania began in the summer. However, as the Romanians were losing heavily, the opportunity to overthrow Antonescu came, and the royal coup of the 23rd of August occurred, in which he was removed from power, and King Michael I of Romania, who led the coup, placed Antonescu under arrest, and then switched sides, joining the Allies and abandoning the Axis cause, and also declaring war on Germany. Ion Antonescu was placed in the custody of PCR militants, and he was held in a number of different places. He was later handed over to the Soviets, who transferred him to Moscow, and was then given rather luxurious mansions in the city, but was kept under house arrest. He was guarded heavily by secret forces, but after the end of the Second World War in Europe, he was moved to Lubyanka prison. Here he was interrogated by the secret services, and he was seen as a key perpetrator of the Holocaust, as his Romanian soldiers were known for performing genocide and organising mass shootings. Whilst he was held in prison, he tried to take his own life, but he then was returned to Romania and Bucharest. He was imprisoned in the Jilaca prison, and was interrogated, but during this he complained about his treatment back home. He complained about the conditions in prison and that he was a vegetarian and he'd not been given a special diet. In May 1946, Antonescu was prosecuted and charged with crimes against peace, treason and war crimes. He was represented by 2 public defenders, and they failed to establish his defence that he had no say in the war and in fact was overruled by Germany, and that he was forced to pick a side between the Soviets and Nazi Germany. Much of the evidence at its trial was uncovered about the massacres oversaw in his time looking after the war effort. Ion Antonescu was found guilty of the charges put before him, and he tried to appeal twice, but they were both rejected, and he was subsequently sentenced to death. He even tried to appeal to the king for clemency, but nothing happened with regards to this. On the 1st of June 1946, he was led out of his prison to an execution site near to the Jihlava prison. A firing squad had been gathered to execute the former Prime Minister of Romania, and Antonescu was led out to face them. In a clearing, he was accompanied to his execution by 4 other men who were dying that day, and Antonescu was the most high-profile to be executed. He was tied to a stake to ensure that he could not move, and images show him stood rather nonchalantly, with his arms crossed and his palms clasped in his final moments. The charges and confirmation of death was read, and then shortly after the firing squad were readied. They were told to aim, and then quickly they fired upon the men, including Antonescu, who was killed instantly. He refused to wear a blindfold facing his executioners, and he raised his hat in a salute once the order to fire was given. At the end of the firing squad, Ion Antonescu had his final moments. He was seen as a warmonger who had overseen barbaric massacres in the course of the Second World War. By choosing to side with Hitler, he nailed his flag to a post and was willing to send his country into the Axis alliance alongside Hitler. He is regarded as a key perpetrator of the Holocaust, and through his policies he was responsible for the deaths of around 400,000 people, including Bessarabian, Romanian and Ukrainian Jews, as well as the Romani. His execution for many was seen as a necessary thing for Romania to move on following World War II. When the Second World War erupted in Europe, to begin with it looked as if the Soviet Red Army and the German Army would not fight each other. Non-aggression pacts were signed between the two nations, and this surprised the world, especially with the fact Hitler quite obviously wanted to rampage to the east, and he wanted to make living space for the Germans inside Soviet-occupied lands. But following the invasion of Poland and the country being carved up between the two, murmurings were heard that one day Hitler would break the treaty, and that the peace between the two huge powers would be broken. On the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched, and this was the largest land offensive in history, as over 10 million combatants took part. The Nazis wanted to destroy the Communists, and they would, during the operation, cause chaos across the Soviet Union and in different lands. The Nazis had been building for an invasion for around a year, and the force that invaded the Soviet Union was propped up by 600,000 vehicles and hundreds of thousands of horses. What happened though opened up the Eastern Front, and during the conflict there would be a huge amount of bloodshed in the area, as the Eastern Front saw some of the most ferocious fighting in history. The cost to both militaries was huge, but there was also a huge cost to civilian life. After the German army would rampage into different lands and seize villages and settlements, then the Einsatzgruppe, an SS paramilitary death squad, would follow, and they would slaughter the civilians. Millions were killed in these attacks, and they would round up civilians and then force them to dig their own graves before they were marched in them, and they would be shot dead. Still today, huge atrocities carried out by the Einsatzgruppe remain uncovered, and thousands of victims remain under the soil. But there was looting that happened everywhere also, and a huge amount of burning of houses, villages and whole areas, which were then razed to the ground. There was a lot of assault committed upon Soviet women by the Germans, and there were even gassings carried out in areas. The Germans also systematically starved to death 3.3 million Soviet prisoners and millions of civilians in the hunger plan, and the plan was to exterminate large elements of the population without having to fire a single bullet. But throughout the onslaught, Stalin was hugely concerned, as the power of the German army would push the Red Army back heavily, and it looked at some point as if the whole of the Soviet lands would fall. But Barbarossa would fail following the horrors of Stalingrad and the reversal of the fortunes of the Soviet Red Army. But to those soldiers who fought in some of the most brutal battles, they had witnessed some of the worst things. But as the Germans occupied different areas, towns and cities, they would establish brutal regimes in which persecution would occur, and mass executions and killings would take place. Things were incredibly tough for the Soviets living under occupation, but some people would make their lives easier and collaborate and work with the Nazis and the Germans, and they would conduct a number of different roles for them. Some would literally become Jew hunters, people who were paid and given food to hunt Jews to then be arrested and executed, or they were then deported to concentration camps. Inside of the city of Krasnodar, there were a number of people who were collaborating with the Nazis, but some would pay the ultimate price for their treason. The Germans, during their occupation of the city, would depend on local people, and they would enlist the help of the local government, policemen and elders. Soviet citizens then became involved in the crimes of the Germans, but there were many others who would encounter the Germans through their jobs, for example farmers. But these people were then seen as collaborators, and later the Soviets would want to inflict punishment and retribution onto anyone who was involved in helping the Germans in any form during the occupations of towns and cities. Authorities would try to punish locals who worked with the Germans, and they would search for traitors who had not been loyal to Stalin during the war. In Krasnodar there was a war crimes trial that was held in July 1943 inside of the city regarding a group of men who had been accused of collaborating with the Germans. These were men who had been involved in helping the Germans throughout the occupation of the city. Krasnodar was occupied by German army groups between the 12th of August 1942 and February 1943, and despite the occupation being around 6 months long, there was a huge amount of suffering in the city. The Einsatzgruppen death squads would arrive in the area, and they would slaughter 7,000 civilians. These victims were made up of Jews and communists, and the occupation forces would use terror to keep the population in line. There was mass shootings carried out in public, and also burnings of homes, and people were executed by hanging in front of crowds, and their remains were left out for days to send a clear, harrowing message. There were even gas vans brought to the city, but the Germans in Krasnodar would need a number of locals to help them and to aid with their slaughter. Once the Germans had left, the authorities then sought to find those who had collaborated, and brought forward were 11 defendants, all of them men, who were said to have been collaborators, and they were Russian and Ukrainian. They were accused of helping the German army, SS and the police in their actions, and they were all accused of being involved in the murders of 7,000 people. But what made these collaborators particularly horrific in their actions was that all of them except for one had joined the Sonderkommando 10A, and this was a sub-detachment of the Einsatzgruppe D, who would execute a massacre around the city. This meant that these men were pivotal to the executions of the Einsatzgruppe, as they would perform different roles such as sorting through clothes which people had left when they arrived at their death sites, or they would be involved in even shepherding driving people to their execution sites and the execution pits before they were then shot. Also, the Sonderkommando would be tasked with cleaning up after the atrocities, and they would cover up the mass graves or burn bodies inside of local crematoriums. These were men who were often forced to collaborate, but many also chose to do it to avoid persecution themselves, but some members would be executed to cover up the German crimes. But at the Krasnodar trial, Richard Ruff, the commander of the German 17th Army and the head of the local Gestapo, along with 13 other SS officials, were charged in absentia. The Soviet defendants were Vasily Tushenko, Ivan Reshlakov, Mikhail Lastovina, Grigory Tushkov, Nikolai Pushkarev, Grigory Misan, Yunus Napskok, Ivan Komartsev, Vasily Pavlov, Ivan Paramanov, and Igansy Kladov. 3 of the men were sentenced to 20 years hard labour, but 8 of them were sentenced to death. Their death sentence was declared on the 17th of July 1943, but the Soviet officials would waste no time in executing those collaborators, as they would be executed the very next day. Following spending the night in prison, the men were then taken to the Krasnodar town square for their execution. Here a large set of gallows had been made, and there are actually 3 separate gallows which would be used for the hangings. At 1 o'clock the men arrived at the foot of the execution device, and there was no scaffold, just a stool and a rope which was tied around the gallows. One by one the rope was secured around their necks, and a placard was placed over their chests that read "Traitor." Following the reading out of the death sentence, as a 30,000 strong crowd watched on, including children, the stools were kicked out from under the traitors' feet and they were then left hanging. One journalist said of the executions, "It was like a signal of the approaching day of reckoning, a stern reminder to those Russians in the occupied regions who still cooperate with the Gestapo. The executions of the traitors was a harbinger of what awaited their German masters." The executions of the traitors of Krasnodar had a profound effect on the Soviet population, as it was heavily publicised, and it was hoped by Stalin that actions like this would prevent further collaboration with his enemies. They also wanted people to see punishment for this, and the Soviets would, throughout the Second World War, continue to execute those who worked with the Germans. They would also execute German soldiers for war crimes. The Soviet Union did suffer during Operation Barbarossa, and there were many people who would want to save their own skin to help with the evils of the Einsatzgruppen and the horrors of the Gestapo. But 30,000 people flocked to the town square in Krasnodar to witness the executions of the 8 men who helped the massacres of the local people and their friends. Retribution and vengeance swept throughout France following D-Day. The nation had been subjected to a rough occupation, and many people had been sent to concentration and extermination camps. The German invasion had been swift and quick, and the French signed an armistice with the Nazis. But there were many people who collaborated, and the French collaborationist government in the southern and eastern parts of the country, the Vichy regime, even brought in groups of militia known as the Milice to deal with the resistance. Thousands of French people were rounded up by those who had been employed to hunt persecuted people by the Gestapo, and there were also French people who took jobs working alongside the Nazi regime as translators, officials, and in other capacities. Women who were suspected of sleeping with the Germans were later subjected to public humiliation following the liberation, and many of those who were involved in the black market or who had worked with the Nazis were rounded up for trial. Even during the war, there were a number of purges, such as the Opération Sauvage or the Wild Purge, in which people suspected of working with the enemy of the French resistance were dragged out after hastily arranged trials, and they were then executed very quickly. Members of the Milice and others who were accused of working with the Nazis were ruthlessly shot in this manner. It's estimated that roughly 4,000 were executed by the resistance, and that's the French resistance's own numbers, and some claim that the number was actually much higher. The US say that roughly 80,000 were executed following the liberation. Many of the executions were photographed and documented by people who witnessed the proceedings, and today these images have lived on in infamy, and they show how the resistance put people to the sword for their actions during World War II. One man who was executed in October 1944 was known as Nittard, and he had been condemned for working for the Germans. One man who witnessed the execution documented what happened, and he picked up the story. He claimed, in October 1944, in the small town of Vienne, France, a French collaborator named Nittard was sentenced to death. He was no large-scale spy, just a man who had been working as a clerk in the German administration, probably for the Gestapo. But one must remember that in the early days of liberation in France, as in any country that had suffered 4 years-long occupation, feelings ran high against any collaborator, big or small. And then, of course, the really dangerous collaborators were not easy to bring to justice, so the small fry had to pay the price for their more fortunate partners in crime. More fuel to the fire had been the executions by the Germans of many great patriots, as in French resistance members, both in Lyon and in Vienne. The outcry was therefore so violent that even though Nittard's appeal to the courts of justice in Grenoble had been successful, the shooting was ordered to take place, so as to not disappoint the population of Vienne. I cannot help feeling, so that everyone in the town should have a chance to watch the execution and share in the general revenge, it was scheduled to take place at noon. 5,000 people, children included, crowded into a square in front of the old military barracks. So intense was the excitement that one could almost smell it, as one can before a bullfight or even a good football game, whilst in the barracks square the condemned man gulped back the traditional glass of rum, and lit the traditional cigarette, as in the last drink and last cigarette he would ever have. He puffed at it a few times, then stubbed it out, thrust the butt into his pocket, and went to face the firing squad. He passed through a hall where the 12 rifles, one with a blank cartridge, had been laid out ready, and walked out into the square to be met by a priest, the firing squad, its commanding officer, and the now strangely silent crowd. This demonstration of public justice shocked me profoundly. No one deplored collaboration more than I, but this punishment seemed to me to be out of all proportion to this man's relatively small crime. My nerves were taut. This man who was about to die was so close. I don't remember whether the crowd was silent now or not. Suddenly I felt very close to that man standing alone in the square. The cigarette butt, injustice to humanity, and then the overwhelming feeling that the man was dead already, that he was like a duck with its head cut off that runs for a minute before finally falling dead. He was dead before he even entered the arena. Even after 15 years, I can't stand using that word. The show was reaching its climax, but now the man was untied from the post. He was a traitor, and traitors are not given the right to meet death facing the squad. The seconds ticked by as he was bound with his back to the rifles, and then they fired. Nittard never saw me, although I was at times no more than 5 feet away. It's not known what specifically Nittard, the collaborator, had done specifically, but it is believed that he was one of those French people who collaborated with the Germans and whose actions for the Gestapo may have led to more deaths, execution and torture. He was shot in the back in a final act of disgrace. Lots of people who resisted the German occupation suffered massively at the hands of the Nazi authorities, and the French resistance would try to purge and get rid of these people as quickly and as ruthlessly as they could. In the years after the war, there were more legal executions carried out, as many collaborators were taken in front of courtrooms and judges, and they were tried before they were then shot inside a French forts by a military firing squad, and men who suffered this included the Vichy Prime Minister, Pierre Laval. But the French resistance sought to brutally punish those who were the enemies of them, even during the Second World War, whilst their country was still being liberated. Inside of Vienne that day, many people witnessed the execution of a man who had worked with the Gestapo and the Nazis for some time, and he paid the ultimate price for his collaboration during the war. But what is interesting is that the eyewitness believed he hadn't really done too much, but for the resistance, any small collaboration was enough for them to shoot you. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.